The dawn chorus of truck engines thundered across the river, shaking the air like a physical force. Private István Kovács pressed his palms against his ears, but the rumble penetrated flesh and bone. Through the mist rising off the water, an endless procession of American supply trucks rolled across the temporary bridge, a structure that seemed impossibly delicate to bear such weight. The wooden planks flexed slightly with each passing vehicle, yet the bridge held firm, hour after hour, as if defying the laws of physics themselves. István had spent 3 years as a combat engineer in the Hungarian army, watching German-built bridges collapse under far less strain. Now, as a prisoner of war in American hands, he stood transfixed by this impossible procession, this river of steel flowing over water on a bridge that should have broken long ago. "Impossible," muttered Captain Danis beside him, the word barely audible above the engines.
"We could never build something so quickly that could carry this much." István nodded silently, counting the trucks as they passed. 10, 20, 50, over 100. Their olive-green sides emblazoned with white stars. Each carried more supplies than his entire company had received in a month on the Eastern Front. The bridge beneath them, constructed in less than 48 hours by American engineers, showed no signs of strain. How could an army move with such speed, such certainty? How could they command materials and expertise that the Axis powers could only dream of? The question gnawed at István like hunger as he watched the endless convoy continue its relentless journey eastward, carrying the supplies that would eventually crush his homeland. The American guards stood casually nearby, rifles held loosely, more focused on their cigarettes than on their prisoners.
They seemed unconcerned, as if the miraculous bridge and its parade of abundance were ordinary, expected, merely another Tuesday in their war. For István, the sight would haunt him long after the bridge itself had been dismantled and the river returned to silence. It was the first crack in everything he had been told about America, a hairline fracture that would eventually shatter his understanding of the world. That evening, in the hastily constructed prisoner camp, István sat on his bunk, the distant rumble of trucks still echoing in his ears. The bridge, that impossible bridge, remained before his eyes even when he closed them. Around him, other Hungarian prisoners whispered in small groups, their voices low but urgent. They too had seen the convoy, had counted the trucks, had witnessed American abundance flowing like water across a structure that Hungarian engineers would have declared impossible to build in such time. Some tried to dismiss it as a trick, a carefully staged display meant to demoralize them, but István knew better. He had studied engineering before the war. What he had seen was no illusion. "Do you think they build everything this way?" asked Mihail, a young farmer from near Lake Balaton, who had been drafted in the final desperate months of fighting. With such excess? István had no answer. In Hungary, they had stretched materials to breaking point, repurposed civilian vehicles, cannibalized abandoned equipment. They had built bridges that could barely support a few light tanks before buckling. The Americans, it seemed, built bridges that could carry armies without hesitation. What did this suggest about the nation behind such capabilities? What did it reveal about the war they had been fighting and losing? As darkness settled over the camp, István's thoughts drifted to his father's workshop in Budapest, where every nail was saved, every scrap of wood preserved. He remembered his father's pride in making things last, in finding clever solutions to material shortages. That resourcefulness had seemed like strength. Now, faced with American abundance, it felt like desperation. The realization settled in his chest like a stone as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the phantom rumble of trucks crossing an impossible bridge still pulsing through his dreams. The next morning brought a new revelation as the prisoners were loaded onto American trucks. István had expected cramped conditions, perhaps open-bed vehicles like the ones used by Hungarian forces. Instead, each prisoner found himself seated in vehicles with rubber tires so thick they seemed impervious to puncture, with engines that purred rather than rattled, with fuel gauges showing full instead of the perpetual empty he had grown accustomed to in the Hungarian army. The convoy moved smoothly along a road that, while hastily constructed, was better than many highways in pre-war Hungary. "These are just their transport trucks," whispered Lieutenant Karoli, a former bank clerk from Debrecen. "Not even their fighting vehicles." The prisoners exchanged glances, the implication clear. If this was how the Americans moved supplies and prisoners, what must their actual war machines be like? The propaganda they had been fed painted Americans as soft, undisciplined, their equipment flashy but impractical. Nothing in that narrative explained the bridge that could support hundreds of heavy trucks, or these transport vehicles that moved with such confident power. As their convoy approached a river crossing, István leaned forward, curious to see another American bridge. What appeared before them was not a temporary structure, but something far more substantial. Engineers worked along its length, reinforcing sections with practiced efficiency. Unlike the makeshift bridges István had helped build on the Eastern Front, desperate attempts to cross rivers under Soviet fire, this one showed careful planning, abundant materials, and a level of engineering expertise that seemed almost casual in its application. The trucks slowed as they approached, and István watched an American officer consulting blueprints spread across the hood of a Jeep. Several engineers pointed to different sections of the bridge, their conversation appearing relaxed despite the critical nature of their work. There was none of the frantic energy he associated with bridge building in the Hungarian army, where every operation felt like a race against both the enemy and material failure. "They're reinforcing it," István explained to the others, his engineering background allowing him to interpret the activity. Not because it's failing, but because they want it to carry even heavier equipment. "What could be heavier than those supply trucks?" asked Mihaly.
"Tanks," said Captain Dennis flatly. "Many tanks." The answer hung in the air as their truck crossed the bridge, the structure not even trembling beneath their weight. István glanced down at the river below, then back at the American engineers, who had already returned to their work without bothering to watch the prisoner transport pass. For them, this was routine. For István, it was a glimpse into a world of material wealth and technical capability so far beyond his experience that it bordered on the fantastic. "My father told me America was all movie studios and gangsters," said Mihai quietly. "He said they could not fight a real war because they had no discipline, no history of struggle." István watched the bridge recede behind them, solid and unmoving under the weight of the trucks that followed. "Your father," he replied, "was mistaken." The words were simple, but carried the weight of a realization that was spreading among the prisoners like a slow tide.
The America they were seeing was not the America they had been told existed. This discrepancy opened a door to questions none of them had dared ask before. What else had they been told that was not true? What other realities awaited them in captivity that would contradict the narratives they had accepted? The truck rounded a bend, and the bridge disappeared from view, but its image remained imprinted in István's mind, a symbol of the first of many contradictions he would encounter in the strange new world of American captivity. The road stretched ahead, leading them deeper into territory both physical and psychological that none of them had been prepared to navigate. The prisoner camp appeared suddenly beyond a rise in the land, a collection of wooden structures surrounded by a perimeter of wire fencing. As their trucks pulled through the gates, István took note of the camp's organization. Neat rows of barracks, separate buildings for what appeared to be mess halls and medical facilities, and most surprisingly, structures still under construction at the far end of the compound. The Americans were expanding the camp, suggesting they expected to house prisoners for some time. Inside, the routine was brisk but not harsh. Guards directed them to barracks with bunks already prepared, each with a blanket and pillow. Captain Danis, ever suspicious, ran his hand over the mattress as if expecting to find some trick or trap. Finding none, he sat down heavily, his expression troubled. "This mattress," he said quietly, "is better than what I slept on as an officer in our own army." Others were making similar discoveries. Private Lajos, a baker from Pécs, held up a blanket in wonder. "Look at this," he marveled. "Pure wool, not that synthetic garbage we got issued." The comparative comfort of their accommodations created an unexpected dissonance. These were enemy captors who, according to everything they had been told, should be treating them with cruelty or at least harsh indifference. Instead, they found themselves in conditions that, while certainly not luxurious, exceeded what many had experienced as soldiers in their own forces. Lieutenant Caroli voiced what many were thinking. Either they have resources to waste on prisoners, or this is how they treat their own men as a matter of course, finished Istvan. The implication was disturbing. If American soldiers routinely enjoyed such provisions, what did that say about the relative strength and capability of the forces they had faced? The prisoners had been told that American soldiers were soft, dependent on comforts that made them vulnerable when those comforts were stripped away. Yet, if this was the American standard, then their forces had never been soft at all. They had simply been well-supplied, well-rested, and thus more effective than their Axis counterparts. That night, lying on his bunk in the darkened barracks, Istvan heard the sounds of construction continuing outside. Even after sunset, American engineers worked under floodlights, their hammers and saws creating a rhythm that seemed to embody their nation's ceaseless productivity. They were building another barracks, another mess hall, perhaps another bridge somewhere beyond the camp perimeter. "They never stop," whispered Mihaly from the next bunk. "It's as if they don't know how to rest." Istvan stared at the ceiling, thinking not of the Americans, but of his last weeks on the front, when his unit had been reduced to scavenging nails from abandoned buildings to repair their equipment, when they had torn up floorboards to reinforce positions because no supplies were forthcoming. The contrast was so stark that it made his chest ache with a complex emotion he could not name, part humiliation, part awe, part a terrible dawning recognition that they had never had a chance against such an opponent. "No," he replied finally, "it's that they don't need to rest. They have enough men, enough materials, enough of everything to keep going when others must stop." In the darkness, someone else's voice added, "And they build bridges that never break." The statement, simple as it was, captured something essential about what they were witnessing. The Americans built things, bridges, camps, supply chains, with a solidity and confidence that spoke of reserves far deeper than anything the Axis powers could muster. It was not just about materials or engineering skill. It was about an approach to war that assumed abundance rather than scarcity, that planned for success rather than merely hoping to stave off failure. As sleep finally claimed him, Istvan's last conscious thought was of that first bridge he had seen, with its endless procession of trucks. It stood in his mind not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of everything he was beginning to understand about the nature of the conflict they had lost and the nation that had helped defeat them. And somehow he knew that in the days to come, there would be more bridges, literal and metaphorical, that would further transform his understanding. When morning came, the prisoners discovered another aspect of American abundance: food. Breakfast in the mess hall included eggs, bread that was both fresh and plentiful, coffee with actual sugar, and portions that seemed extravagant compared to what they had survived on during the final months of fighting. Istvan watched as Mikhail stared at his plate in disbelief before tentatively taking a bite, as if expecting the food to disappear. "I haven't had an egg in over a year," said Major Gabor, a career officer who had maintained a rigid military bearing despite their capture. Now, facing a plate of food that would have been considered a feast in Hungary, his composure cracked slightly. "My wife would queue for hours in Budapest, hoping for just one to feed our children." "The Americans must have chicken farms the size of our counties," said Lieutenant Caroli, attempting a joke that fell flat in the face of the uncomfortable truth it contained. After breakfast, they were assigned work details. Istvan found himself part of a group designated to assist American engineers at a river crossing several miles from the camp. As their truck approached the site, he saw that a bridge damaged during recent fighting was being not just repaired, but entirely reconstructed. The scope of the operation was unlike anything he had witnessed in the Hungarian army. "We'll be replacing the entire support structure," explained Sergeant Miller, a square-jawed American engineer with hands like shovels. He spoke through a translator, but gestured directly to Istvan and the other prisoners with an unexpected collegial respect. Your job will be to help move materials and assist our welding teams. Istvan translated this for the others, adding, "This man speaks to us like fellow engineers, not enemies." As they began work, Istvan observed the American operation with professional interest. The engineering corps had equipment he had only read about in technical journals: portable welding units, hydraulic lifts, prefabricated sections that fit together with precision. Most striking was the atmosphere among the American workers. Despite the critical nature of the bridge reconstruction, there was an ease, even occasional laughter, that suggested confidence rather than anxiety.
"How many bridges has your unit built?" Istvan asked Sergeant Miller during a brief break, the translator relaying his question. "This year? Probably 30, maybe more," Miller replied casually. "We got pretty good at it after Normandy." The translator conveyed this to Istvan, whose eyes widened. His entire engineering company in the Hungarian army had managed to construct perhaps 7 bridges in 2 years, and most of those had been small structures that failed within weeks due to material shortages or design compromises. By midday, the progress was remarkable. Support pylons were already in place, with the main span beginning to take shape. American supply trucks arrived regularly with more materials: steel beams, concrete, lumber, all in quantities that seemed limitless. Istvan and the other prisoners worked steadily, their initial reluctance giving way to professional engagement with the task.
"Look at these welding seams," Istvan pointed out to Captain Danish, who had been a civil engineer before the war. "The precision, the consistency, and they're doing this in the field, not in a factory." Danis examined the work with a critical eye, then shook his head in reluctant admiration. "We were taught that Americans build everything quickly but poorly, that their infrastructure was flashy but would not last." He ran his hand along a perfectly aligned steel beam. "This will stand for decades." "If they wanted to," added Istvan, "more likely they'll replace it with something better once the war is over." The concept was almost impossible to grasp, that a nation might build something solid and enduring only to later replace it with something improved, not because the original had failed, but simply because improvement was possible.
It represented a fundamentally different relationship with resources and possibility than what they had known in Hungary, where things were used until they broke, then repaired until repair was no longer feasible, then finally discarded only with reluctance. When the workday ended, Istvan found himself standing on the partially completed bridge, looking out over the river. The American engineers were already packing up for the day, their tools and equipment organized for the next morning's work. In just one day, they had accomplished what might have taken his Hungarian unit 2 weeks or more. And tomorrow they would do the same, and the day after, with the same equipment, the same materials, the same confident expertise. "They don't worry about running out," he realized aloud. "That's the difference. Everything we did was shaped by the fear of scarcity. Everything they do assumes abundance." The translator, who had been standing nearby, heard this and smiled slightly.
"The sergeant says you understand bridge building. He wants you on the design team tomorrow, not just moving materials." Istvan nodded, surprised by the offer and the implicit recognition of his expertise. As they boarded the trucks to return to camp, he found himself thinking not of bridges, but of the 2 worlds they represented. The one he had come from, defined by shortages and compromises, and this American reality of seemingly limitless capability. "They asked me to join their design team tomorrow," he told Mihaly as they rode back to camp. "They said I understand bridges." "Do you?" asked the younger man. Istvan looked out the truck window at the passing landscape, the half-built bridge already receding into the distance. "I thought I did," he said quietly. "Now I'm not so sure." What followed in the days and weeks ahead was a profound education, not just in American bridge-building techniques, but in the entire American approach to war and logistics. Istvan, assigned to work directly with the engineering teams, found himself learning more than he taught. The Americans used prefabricated components that could be assembled quickly. standardized designs that could be adapted to various terrain, and materials testing methods he had never encountered. Most impressive was their systematic approach to problem solving. When an issue arose with the bridge's central span, István watched as American engineers gathered, discussed multiple solutions, tested each against practical constraints, and selected an approach, all within hours, not the days of deliberation and permission-seeking he had experienced in the Hungarian army. "You see that?" pointed out Lieutenant Öden, another prisoner working on the bridge. "That sergeant just made a decision that would have required 3 levels of approval in our forces. And his commander supported it without question," added István, noting how the American officer had simply nodded at the sergeant's plan and allocated the necessary resources. This decentralized decision-making extended throughout the operation. Junior officers made substantive choices without constantly deferring to superiors. Engineers in the field adapted plans based on real-world conditions. The entire system operated with a flexibility that somehow increased rather than diminished its effectiveness. One morning, István arrived at the worksite to find the American engineers clustered around blueprints for an entirely new bridge design. The translator explained that intelligence reports indicated they might need to support heavier tanks in the coming offensive, so the bridge specifications had been upgraded overnight. "They're strengthening it beyond what's necessary now because of what might be needed later," István explained to the other prisoners. "They plan not just for current needs, but for future possibilities." "How can they afford to do this?" asked Mihail, bewildered. "The materials alone." István had been wondering the same thing. During a break, he questioned Sergeant Miller through the translator, trying to understand the economics behind such apparent excess. "Isn't it wasteful?" he asked carefully. "Building stronger than needed?" Miller laughed, a short, practical sound. "More wasteful to build twice," he replied, "or to have a bridge fail when you need it most. We build once, build right." The philosophy was simple yet profound. The initial investment in materials and time was higher, but the long-term benefits, reliability, adaptability to changing needs, reduced maintenance, outweighed the costs. It was an approach possible only with abundant resources and confidence in future capabilities, neither of which the Hungarian forces had possessed. As days passed, István found himself increasingly respected by the American engineers. They listened to his suggestions, incorporated his ideas where practical, and treated him more as a colleague than a prisoner. This professional respect both gratified and disturbed him. It suggested that the Americans saw value in people regardless of their status or nationality, another contradiction to what he had been told about American arrogance and disregard for others. The bridge neared completion faster than István had thought possible. Standing on its nearly finished span, watching as the first test vehicles crossed, he felt a complicated pride in having contributed to its construction, mingled with the uncomfortable knowledge that this bridge would help American forces advance against his countrymen still fighting elsewhere. "It will hold," he said quietly to Captain Denish, who stood beside him watching the tests. "It might be the strongest bridge I've ever helped build." Denish nodded, his expression troubled. "And we built it for them." The words carried the weight of their situation. Prisoners contributing to the very infrastructure that would ensure Allied victory. Yet István could not deny the professional satisfaction of participating in construction done right, with proper materials and methods. The bridge represented both his complicity and his education, a physical manifestation of the contradictions of his captivity. That evening, back at camp, the prisoners who had worked on the bridge spoke in hushed tones about their experiences. Their conversations had evolved from initial shock at American capabilities to more nuanced discussions of the differences in approach and philosophy they had observed. "Their bridges are like their country," observed Major Gabor thoughtfully. "Built with the assumption of growth, of increasing weight, of future needs we can't yet imagine. While ours," began Lieutenant Karoli, "ours were built to hold just enough, for just long enough," finished István. "And when they failed, we blamed the materials, the weather, the enemy, everything except the fundamental approach. The acknowledgement was painful. They had been part of a military system that operated on principles of scarcity, hierarchy, and rigidity, facing an opponent that embodied abundance, flexibility, and innovation. The bridges they had helped build as prisoners stood as irrefutable evidence of the gap between these two worlds. As István lay on his bunk that night, he thought of the villages in Hungary, the bridges over the Danube and Tisa rivers, the infrastructure of his homeland that had seemed impressive before the war. How would he see them now, with eyes trained by American engineering? Would he notice the compromises, the shortcuts, the limitations he had previously accepted as normal? And if he did, what would that mean for how he understood his country's place in the world? The question troubled his sleep. But morning brought no answers. Only another day of work on another American bridge that would stand long after the war had ended and the prisoners had returned home. Each day they were transported to different bridge projects, witnessing the American capacity to transform landscapes with steel and concrete, to connect points across seemingly impassable barriers, to enable movement where there had been obstacles. During one such journey, their truck passed a major railway bridge under construction. The scale was monumental, a massive steel structure spanning a wide river, with dozens of engineers and hundreds of workers swarming over it like ants on a massive steel colony. István stared in amazement at the project, which dwarfed anything he had seen even in Budapest before the war. "That will carry trains from the coast all the way to the front," explained their translator, noticing his interest. "Double-tracked, reinforced for the heaviest loads." "How long to build something like that?" István asked. 6 weeks from start to finish," came the casual reply. The answer struck him like a physical blow. A comparable bridge in pre-war Hungary would have been a years-long project, celebrated in newspapers, visited by government officials. Here, it was just another construction site, one of many, expected to be completed on a timeline that seemed impossible. "They cannot keep this up forever," insisted Captain Dinas later, when István shared what he had learned. "No nation has unlimited resources." István considered this, remembering the endless convoys he had seen crossing bridges all across the territory they had traversed as prisoners. What if their limits are simply much further than we imagined? What if what looks like excess to us is merely normal for them? The possibility was disturbing because it suggested not just a temporary advantage, but a fundamental disparity that no amount of sacrifice or determination on their side could have overcome. If American abundance was not extraordinary but ordinary, then the war had been lost before it began. Not because of tactical errors or leadership failures, but because of a material reality that no strategy could have changed. As summer turned to fall, the prisoners were moved to a more permanent camp deeper in Allied territory. During the journey, István observed more bridges, each telling the same story of American engineering and logistical capacity. Some were temporary structures, others permanent installations, but all shared the same characteristics: solid construction, abundant materials, designs that anticipated future needs rather than merely meeting current ones. In the new camp, prisoners with technical skills were assigned to workshops where they assisted with maintenance and construction projects. István found himself in a drafting room, working alongside American engineers on bridge designs for areas not yet captured but anticipated in future operations. "They planned 6 months ahead," he told Mihai during evening meal. "They're designing bridges for rivers they haven't even reached yet." "How can they be so sure they'll reach them?" asked the younger man. István considered the question. "Because their bridges never fail," he said simply. "They build a path, and then they follow it. And nothing, not rivers, not mountains, not enemy action, seems to stop them for long." The metaphor extended beyond physical structures. The Americans seemed to approach every aspect of the war with the same confidence, the same assumption that obstacles existed to be overcome rather than to define limits. It was a mindset as much as a material reality, a way of seeing the world as malleable rather than fixed. In the camp library, itself a luxury unimaginable in Axis prisoner camps, István found technical journals and engineering textbooks in multiple languages. He spent evenings studying American construction techniques, bridge designs, and infrastructure planning. What he read confirmed his observations. American approaches prioritized speed, standardization, adaptability, and future capacity over immediate cost savings. They build bridges not just for the vehicles they have, he explained to others interested in his findings, but for the vehicles they expect to develop in the future. This forward-looking perspective permeated everything he observed about American operations. They planned not just for the next battle, but for the next phase of the war, and beyond that, for the peace that would follow. It was a stark contrast to the increasingly desperate improvisation that had characterized the final months of his service in the Hungarian army. Winter brought new challenges to bridge construction, but American operations continued with barely a pause. István, now trusted enough to participate in design discussions, watched as engineers simply incorporated cold weather specifications into their plans: better drainage, different concrete mixtures, heating elements for critical components. The weather was treated not as an enemy, but merely as another factor to be analyzed and accommodated. In our army, he confided to Lieutenant Karl one evening, winter meant delay, excuse, reduced expectations. For them, it's just another engineering problem to solve. Like us, said Caro quietly. We too were just problems to be solved. The observation carried a bitter truth. The American approach to prisoners, practical, systematic, generally humane, paralleled their approach to bridges. Both were challenges to be addressed efficiently, without unnecessary cruelty, but also without sentiment clouding function. The prisoners were housed, fed, and utilized in ways that made practical sense within the larger system of American war-making. As Christmas approached, the camp received unexpected luxuries: better food, small gifts from aid organizations, even a dusting of decorations in common areas. The contrast with what they knew their families must be experiencing in Hungary was painful. István had received no letters, had no way of knowing if his parents and sister in Budapest had survived the Soviet advance. During Christmas dinner, a meal far more abundant than holiday celebrations in pre-war Hungary, Major Gabor raised a toast that captured their collective experience. "To bridges," he said, lifting his cup of real coffee. "Those we built, those we crossed, and those we burned behind us." The metaphor resonated deeply. They had indeed crossed bridges, both literal and figurative, that had changed their understanding of the war and their place in it. They had helped build structures that would carry the forces that defeated their homeland. And they had, in many ways, burned bridges to their past selves. The men who had believed in ultimate victory, who had accepted without question the narratives they had been taught. István raised his cup with the others, thinking not of Christmas, but of that first bridge he had seen, the one that had begun his education. It seemed a lifetime ago, though only months had passed. He was different now, transformed not by captivity itself, but by what captivity had shown him about the world. "The bridges remain," he said quietly, adding his own toast. "Long after the war ends, after we return home, after memories fade, the bridges will still stand." Around him, others nodded in solemn understanding. The physical structures they had helped create would indeed outlast the conflict, carrying peaceful traffic across rivers that had once marked battle lines. But the metaphorical bridges, between nations, between enemies who had become reluctant colleagues, between old understandings and new realities, these might prove more fragile, more difficult to maintain once they returned to a homeland devastated by war and occupied by new forces. As the new year of 1946 dawned, rumors of repatriation began to circulate through the camp. The war had been over for months, and arrangements were being made to return prisoners to their countries of origin. For the Hungarians, this meant returning to a nation now under Soviet influence with an uncertain future ahead. In his final days as a prisoner, István was taken once more to see the railway bridge he had glimpsed under construction months earlier. Now complete, it carried a constant stream of trains, military transports giving way to civilian shipments. the machinery of war gradually transforming into the infrastructure of peace. The bridge stood as a symbol of transition, of continuity beyond conflict. "What will you build when you return home?" asked Sergeant Miller through the translator during this final visit. The question was practical rather than philosophical, engineer to engineer. István considered it carefully. "Bridges," he said finally, "but different ones than before, better ones." Miller nodded, understanding the dual meaning. "Good luck," he said simply, extending his hand in a gesture that crossed the boundaries of their formal relationship as captor and captive. As István shook the American's hand, he realized that the most significant bridge he would need to build would be between his old understanding of the world and the new one he had gained in captivity. How could he explain to those at home what he had seen? How could he convey the lessons of American bridges to people who had never witnessed their strength, their abundance, their confident permanence? In the end, perhaps he couldn't. Some experiences resisted translation, remaining personal transformations that changed the observer without necessarily changing those around them. But he could build actual bridges, incorporating what he had learned, creating structures in Hungary that embodied the principles he had discovered during captivity. As their transport prepared to depart for the repatriation center, István took a final look at the American landscape that had been both his prison and his classroom. The bridges they had helped construct dotted the territory, some visible in the distance, others existing only in his memory. Each represented not just an engineering achievement, but a lesson in how nations approached obstacles, how they allocated resources, how they envisioned their future. "Are you ready?" asked Mihaly, now his close friend despite their different backgrounds. István nodded, turning away from the view. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready to build bridges at home." The simple statement contained his hope for the future, that what he had learned might somehow contribute to rebuilding his shattered homeland, that the principles of solid construction might apply not just to physical structures, but to societies recovering from war. It was perhaps naive, certainly optimistic, but it offered a path forward through the uncertainty that awaited them. As their truck pulled away from the camp for the last time, István thought once more of that first bridge he had seen, with its endless convoy of American trucks crossing a river that had once seemed an impassable barrier. The image had changed him, had begun an education that no formal schooling could have provided. Now it was his turn to become the bridge, between what he had been and what he had become, between what he had known and what he now understood, between the ruins of the past and the possibilities of the future. Perhaps that was the final lesson of American bridges. They connected places that would otherwise remain separate. They transformed obstacles into pathways. They made possible journeys that could not otherwise occur. And while they might be built of steel and concrete, their true strength lay in the ideas they embodied. Ideas about overcoming limitations, about connecting what was divided, about building not just for today's needs, but for tomorrow's possibilities. If he could carry those ideas home, then his time as a prisoner would have built a bridge of its own, one spanning not rivers, but understanding, not territories, but perspectives. In the years to come, perhaps others would cross that invisible bridge, as countless vehicles had crossed the solid American structures he had helped build. Perhaps the quiet lessons of engineering would echo beyond the technical into the human, teaching not just how to span rivers, but how to connect worlds. For bridges, he now understood, were never merely about crossing water. They were about bringing together what was separate, about making continuous what had been broken, about transforming impossible journeys into daily passages. Have you ever wondered what lessons lie hidden in the structures we build? What they reveal about who we are and what we believe possible? The bridges remain, long after those who built them have gone, silent teachers for anyone willing to look beyond their function to their meaning.